The morning started like any other at the Denver Police Department. Captain Chen walked through the familiar hallways of the precinct, greeting her colleagues with her usual warm smile. The smell of coffee wafted through the air as officers shuffled papers and answered phone calls. After 15 years on the force, these morning routines had become second nature to her. Her office, a modest space with walls covered in commendations and community service awards, felt like a second home. Family photos lined her desk: her parents at her police academy graduation, her sister's wedding, and her nephew's first birthday. Each image reminded her why she'd chosen this path: to make her community safer for families like hers. Captain Chen had earned every step up the ladder, from walking the beat to leading major investigations. Known for her straight-arrow approach and dedication to clean policing, she'd helped implement new training programs and community outreach initiatives. Her fellow officers often joked that she could spot a dirty cop from a mile away, a skill that would soon put her entire career in jeopardy. That December morning, the temperature outside had dropped below freezing, and frost covered the precinct's windows. Chen was reviewing files for an ongoing internal investigation, something that had been keeping her up at night for weeks. She'd uncovered disturbing patterns in several recent drug busts, where evidence seemed to vanish mysteriously or suspects somehow knew about raids before they happened. As she sipped her green tea, a gift from her mother, Chen heard heavy footsteps approaching her office. At first, she thought nothing of it. Officers were always coming and going, seeking her guidance or approval for various operations. But something felt different this time. The footsteps were too many, too purposeful. The door burst open without a knock. Officer Thompson, someone she'd worked with for years, stood at the front of a group of internal affairs investigators. His face was set in stone, avoiding her questioning gaze. Behind him, 2 more officers positioned themselves on either side of her door. "Captain Chen," Thompson's voice cracked slightly. "Please stand up and place your hands where we can see them." The room suddenly felt ice cold. Her teacup froze halfway to her lips, her hand trembling slightly as she set it down. "What's going on here?" "We have a warrant for your arrest," Thompson continued, pulling out a document. "You're being charged with evidence tampering and obstruction of justice." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her mind raced through recent cases, trying to understand what could have led to this. She'd been nothing but thorough in her work, especially with evidence handling. Every procedure followed to the letter, every form filed in triplicate. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting in her mind. Officers she'd trained, mentored, and trusted were now treating her like a common criminal. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just 3 weeks ago, she'd launched an investigation into suspicious activities within the department. As Thompson read her rights, Chen noticed curious faces peering through her office windows. Colleagues she'd worked with for years watched as she was handcuffed, their expressions a mix of shock, disappointment, and in some cases, what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. The walk through the precinct was the longest of her life. Each step echoed in the suddenly silent hallway. Officers turned away or stared openly as she passed. Only Officer Rivera, a rookie she'd recently mentored, showed any sign of support, meeting her eyes with a look of disbelief and concern. In a cruel twist of fate, they led her to the holding cells she'd walked past countless times, the same cells where she'd interrogated suspects and processed arrests. Now she found herself on the other side of the bars, her badge and service weapon confiscated, her career hanging by a thread. As the cell door clanged shut, Chen took a deep breath and forced herself to think like the investigator she was. This wasn't random. The timing, right after she'd started looking into departmental irregularities, was too perfect to be coincidence. Someone wanted her stopped, and they'd found a way to do it that would destroy not just her investigation, but her entire career. Sitting on the cold bench, Chen remembered something her father, a former judge, always told her: "The truth is like water, it always finds a way to flow." She knew she was innocent, and somewhere out there was evidence to prove it. But for now, all she could do was wait, watching through the bars as her colleagues went about their day, wondering which ones she could still trust. Little did her accusers know, but this arrest wouldn't be the end of Captain Chen's story. It would be the beginning of something much bigger, something that would shake the Denver Police Department to its very foundations. The holding cell felt smaller with each passing hour. Captain Chen sat on the hard metal bench, her back against the cold concrete wall, trying to piece together the puzzle that had landed her here. The familiar sounds of the precinct, phones ringing, doors closing, voices echoing through the corridors, now seemed distant and surreal from this side of the bars. She'd been in this building countless times during night shifts, but never had it felt so lonely. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cell floor. Her thoughts drifted to the investigation she'd started 3 weeks ago, the one that had made her stomach churn with each new discovery. It had started with a simple irregularity in the evidence logs. A sharp-eyed clerk in the property room had noticed something odd about the paperwork from recent drug busts. Small discrepancies at first, weights that didn't match, seal numbers that didn't sequence correctly. Most people would have written it off as clerical errors, but Chen knew better. In 15 years of police work, she'd learned that the biggest cases often started with the smallest details. The more she dug, the more disturbing the pattern became. Major drug raids were coming up empty more often than statistics could explain. Suspects were somehow vanishing just hours before planned arrests. Evidence was being logged correctly but somehow disappearing during transfers. It all pointed to someone inside the department, someone with access to sensitive information. Now, sitting in the cell, Chen couldn't help but laugh at the irony. She'd been charged with evidence tampering, the very crime she'd been investigating. The evidence they claimed she'd tampered with was from the Lancaster Street raid, one of the biggest drug busts in department history. She remembered that day clearly, had personally overseen the logging and storage of every piece of evidence. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Through the cell bars, she caught glimpses of officers passing by. Some avoided looking at her entirely, while others threw quick, uncertain glances her way. Officer Wilson, who'd worked with her on numerous cases, walked past 3 times without making eye contact. But it was Detective Rivera's reaction that caught her attention. The young officer's face showed not judgment, but concern. As the hours ticked by, Chen's mind raced through recent events. The Lancaster Street raid had rattled some powerful people. The amount of drugs seized should have led to major arrests up the supply chain, but somehow the investigation had stalled. Key suspects had vanished, evidence had become contaminated, and witnesses had suddenly developed memory problems. She thought about the internal investigation she'd launched. She'd been careful, kept everything close to the vest, only sharing information with a select few. But someone had caught wind of it. The question was who? And more importantly, how high up did this go? The sound of footsteps approaching her cell snapped her out of her thoughts. It was her old partner, Detective Lee, with her attorney. Lee's face was a mask of professional detachment, but his eyes told a different story. They'd worked together for 7 years, solved countless cases. He knew her better than almost anyone in the department. "Your preliminary hearing is set for tomorrow morning," Lee said, his voice carefully neutral. "Your attorney here wants to talk strategy." As the attorney began explaining her options, Chen noticed something in Lee's stance. To anyone else, he looked like just another cop doing his job. But she recognized his supple head tilt, the way he positioned himself. It was their old signal from undercover work. He was telling her he had her back. The attorney laid out the charges: evidence tampering from the Lancaster Street case, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority. Each charge carefully crafted to destroy not just her career, but her credibility. The evidence against her looked solid on paper: security footage showing her in the evidence room during unauthorized hours, log entries that didn't match the physical evidence, witness statements claiming she'd acted suspiciously. But something didn't add up. The security footage they mentioned, she knew every camera in that building, knew the blind spots and timing of the feeds. If someone had doctored that footage, they'd need access to the security system's main servers. That level of access was limited to a handful of high-ranking officers. As her attorney continued talking, Chen's mind began connecting dots. The missing evidence, the leaked raid information, the tampered security footage, it all pointed to someone with serious influence within the department. Someone who had the power to orchestrate her arrest and the authority to make it stick. Through the cell window, she could see the sun setting over the Denver skyline. The same view she used to admire from her office now looked different, tainted by shadows of corruption she'd never noticed before. But as darkness fell over the city, something else began to take shape in her mind. A plan. They thought they'd silenced her by putting her in this cell. They thought that by destroying her reputation, they'd bury the truth she'd been uncovering. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd given her nothing but time to think, to remember, to piece together all the little inconsistencies she'd noticed over the past few months. Tomorrow, they'd take her to court, thinking they had her cornered. But Captain Chen had spent her career studying how criminals think, how they operate, how they make mistakes. Now she'd use every bit of that knowledge to expose the real criminals, the ones wearing badges. As night fell over the precinct, Chen settled onto the thin mattress, her mind clearer than it had been all day. Someone in the department wanted her gone because she'd gotten too close to the truth. They'd framed her because they were scared of what she'd discover. And if there's one thing she'd learned in 15 years of police work, it's that scared people make mistakes. The question wasn't if she'd clear her name, it was how many corrupt officers she'd expose in the process. The morning after Captain Chen's arrest, the atmosphere in the Denver Police Department was thick with tension. Officers gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves, conversations stopping abruptly when others walked by. The news had spread like wildfire, and everyone was choosing sides, though most weren't brave enough to choose openly. Detective Lee sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen but seeing nothing. He'd known Chen for 7 years, worked countless cases with her, seen her unwavering dedication to justice. The idea that she would tamper with evidence was like suggesting the sun might rise in the west. It simply didn't add up. His thoughts were interrupted by Officer Rivera, the young rookie Chen had mentored. She approached his desk cautiously, coffee cup in hand, trying to look casual. "Detective," she said quietly, "got a minute?" They met in the stairwell, one of the few places in the building not covered by security cameras. Rivera's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Something's not right about this whole thing," she whispered. "Last week, I was filing reports in the records room when I overheard Lieutenant Patterson making a strange phone call. He was talking about taking care of the problem and mentioned the Lancaster Street case." Lee's expression remained neutral, but his mind was racing. Patterson was one of the officers Chen had been investigating. "Tell me everything you remember about that call," he said. As Rivera shared more details, another officer joined them. It was Officer Kim from the evidence room, looking nervous but determined. "I've been keeping my own logs," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "There have been discrepancies. Times when high-ranking officers accessed the evidence room without following proper protocols, usually late at night. A small group of loyal officers began to form, each bringing pieces of a larger puzzle. Detective Lee coordinated their efforts carefully, knowing they were putting their careers, and possibly more, on the line. They met in different places each time. The diner 3 blocks from the precinct, the park across town, the parking garage where the security cameras never quite worked right. Meanwhile, Chen's attorney, Mrs. Wu, was fighting her own battle in the legal arena. She discovered troubling inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence. The timestamps on the security footage didn't match the department's access logs. Witness statements seemed rehearsed, using surprisingly similar language. And most importantly, the chain of custody documentation for the Lancaster Street evidence had gaps that conveniently implicated Chen. They rushed this case, Mrs. Wu told Chen during a private meeting. "When people rush, they make mistakes. We just need to find them all." The loyal officers worked in shifts, carefully gathering information while maintaining their regular duties. Officer Kim started volunteering for extra evidence room shifts, documenting every unusual access. Rivera used her rookie status to her advantage. Nobody paid much attention to a new officer asking seemingly naive questions about departmental procedures. Detective Lee focused on the bigger picture, especially the Lancaster Street case. He requested old case files, crime scene photos, witness statements, anything that might shed light on why this particular case had become the weapon used against Chen. He noticed something odd. Several key pieces of evidence had been logged but never photographed, breaking standard procedure. One evening, as Lee was reviewing these files in his car, a shadow fell across his windshield. His hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but it was only Officer Thompson, the same officer who had arrested Chen. Lee tensed, but Thompson raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I've been watching you," Thompson said, sliding into the passenger seat. "You're digging into the Lancaster Street case. He paused, looking around nervously. "There's something you need to know. The night before the raid, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." Thompson's revelation added another piece to the puzzle. He'd seen two high-ranking officers entering the evidence room after hours, carrying duffel bags. He'd kept quiet out of fear, but Chen's arrest had been weighing on his conscience. The small resistance group grew cautiously. Each new member was vetted carefully, their motivations scrutinized. They used burner phones, paid for in cash. They created code words for different types of evidence and various officers under investigation. Everything had to be done perfectly. One mistake could blow the whole operation. Mrs. Wu worked tirelessly on Chen's defense, but she also served as a crucial link between Chen and her supporters. During legal visits, she passed carefully coded messages hidden in case documents. Chen's responses came back the same way, guiding the investigation from behind bars. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The department's IT specialist, a quiet man named Chang, who'd worked there for decades, approached Li with a USB drive. "I maintain the security system," he said simply. "I keep backups. The footage they're using against Captain Chen, it's been altered. I can prove it." As the evidence mounted, so did the danger. Officer Rivera noticed she was being followed on her way home. Detective Li's apartment was broken into, though nothing was taken. Officer Kim found his locker vandalized. But instead of scaring them off, these intimidation tactics only confirmed they were on the right track. They were getting close to something big, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. The Lancaster Street case wasn't just about drugs, it was about corruption at the highest levels of the department. Chen had started pulling on a thread, and now the whole tapestry of lies was beginning to unravel. Late one night, as the small group met in the basement of a closed coffee shop, Detective Li laid out everything they'd discovered. The evidence tampering, the witness intimidation, the altered security footage, it all pointed to an organized system of corruption that had existed for years. Captain Chen didn't just stumble onto someone stealing evidence, Li concluded. She found a whole network of dirty cops, and they tried to destroy her before she could expose them. The group looked at each other, understanding the gravity of what they'd uncovered. They weren't just fighting to clear Chen's name anymore, they were fighting to clean up their entire department. The question was, did they have enough evidence to bring down the corrupt officers without getting themselves destroyed in the process? As they dispersed into the night, each taking different routes home to avoid being followed, they knew the next few days would determine everything. The truth was within their grasp, but the most dangerous part of their mission still lay ahead. The basement of Mrs. Wu's law office had become the unofficial headquarters for their investigation. Detective Li spread dozens of photos and documents across a large table, connecting them with red string, just like the crime boards he'd made countless times before. But this time, the suspects were his fellow officers. Out on bail but suspended from duty, Captain Chen sat nearby, her eyes scanning the evidence they'd gathered. Dark circles under her eyes revealed sleepless nights, but her mind remained sharp as ever. "Show me what you found at the warehouse again," she said, pointing to a stack of surveillance photos. Detective Li pulled out several grainy images taken from across the street from an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. The photos showed police cars arriving at odd hours, officers carrying duffel bags, and, most interestingly, known drug dealers entering through a side door. Officer Rivera tracked the patrol patterns, Li explained, laying out a map marked with highlighted routes. Every Tuesday and Friday night, patrols are redirected away from this area for exactly 47 minutes. Too consistent to be coincidence. Chen nodded slowly. And the connection to Deputy Commissioner Wright? Li pinned up a new photo, a shot of a luxury car leaving the warehouse area. His personal vehicle, spotted 3 times in the past month, always on delivery nights. The investigation had revealed a pattern so brazen it was almost unbelievable. Corrupt officers weren't just taking bribes to look the other way. They were actively protecting drug shipments, providing escort services, and using police resources to ensure smooth operations. Officer Kim, still working his evidence room shifts, had documented how it worked. They logged the seized drugs correctly at first, he explained, pointing to his meticulous notes. But before the evidence goes to the lab for testing, certain officers sign it out for additional processing. When it comes back, the weight is always slightly less, sometimes a lot less. The network was sophisticated. Regular patrol officers were paid to adjust their routes. Dispatch operators were bribed to delay response times in certain areas. Even some lab technicians were involved, falsifying test results to hide evidence tampering. "But here's what I don't understand," Rivera said, joining them after her shift. "Why take the risk? These officers make good money. The deputy commissioner makes 6 figures. Why risk everything?" Chen stood up, walking to the crime board. "Greed is only part of it. This is about power. They're not just taking bribes, they're controlling who sells drugs in Denver. They decide which dealers to bust and which ones to protect. That kind of power becomes addictive." The evidence was mounting. Chang, the aid specialist, had recovered deleted emails showing coded communications between corrupt officers. Thompson had photographed license plates from suspicious meetings. Even the janitor had helped, saving shredded documents from certain officers' trash bins. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous their position became. Officer Rivera's car brake lines had been cut, luckily discovered during a routine check. Detective Lee's teenage son had been followed home from school. Anonymous threats were left in their lockers. "They're getting nervous," Chen observed, studying a threatening note left on Mrs. Wu's windshield. "Which means we're getting close." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young dealer, arrested by an honest officer during a routine traffic stop, was ready to talk. He'd been paying protection money for months, keeping detailed records of every payment as insurance. "Look at these names," Lee said, spreading out the dealer's ledger. The list included officers from nearly every precinct, with payment amounts and dates carefully noted. But more shocking were the initials at the top of each page: DCO. Deputy Commissioner Wright, Chen breathed. He wasn't just involved, he was running the whole operation. The pieces started falling into place. Wright had been with the department for 30 years, building a network of loyal officers who owed him favors. When the drug trade in Denver started booming, he saw an opportunity. Instead of fighting it, he decided to control it. Mrs. Wu studied the evidence carefully. "This is bigger than we thought. Wright doesn't just have officers in his pocket, he's got connections in the DA's office, the city council, maybe even higher." The group worked through the night, organizing their evidence. They had patrol records showing suspicious patterns, financial documents revealing unexplained deposits, surveillance photos, witness statements, and recovered emails. But most importantly, they had the dealer's ledger, a detailed record of corruption that couldn't be explained away. "We can't take this to internal affairs," Chen said finally. "The corruption goes too deep. We need to go outside the department." Lee nodded. "I have a contact in the FBI's public corruption unit. But once we make that call, there's no turning back. Wright and his people will know we're coming." The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. They were about to accuse the second highest-ranking officer in the department of running a criminal enterprise. The blowback would be severe. "If we do this," Rivera said, voicing what everyone was thinking, "we're not just risking our jobs. These people have already shown they're willing to use violence to protect themselves." Chen looked around the room at the small group of honest cops who'd risked everything to uncover the truth. "I won't ask any of you to take this risk. You've already done more than I could have asked." One by one, they stood up. Officer Kim, Rivera, Thompson, Chang. Each of them had seen too much to walk away now. "The department we serve doesn't exist anymore," Lee said quietly. "Wright and his people corrupted it. If we want it back, we have to fight for it." Chen picked up the dealer's ledger, feeling its weight in her hands. This little book could bring down the entire network, but only if they could get it to the right people before Wright's officers got to them. "Tomorrow morning," she decided, "we take everything to the FBI. Tonight, we make copies of everything and store them in separate locations. If anything happens to any of us, the evidence still gets out." As they packed up the evidence, each person understood the gravity of what lay ahead. They weren't just police officers anymore. They were about to become whistleblowers against one of the most powerful corruption networks in Denver's history. The night was far from over, and the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. Chang had always preferred the quiet of the police department's server room to the bustle of the main office. The gentle hum of cooling fans and blinking lights felt more honest than the fake smiles and whispered conversations upstairs. As the department's senior IT specialist, he'd spent 15 years maintaining these systems, knowing every cable and connection like the back of his hand. Tonight was different. His hands trembled slightly as he connected his laptop to the main server. What he was about to do could cost him his job, or worse. But after seeing Captain Chen arrested, after watching good officers being threatened and harassed, he couldn't stay quiet anymore. The system keeps automatic backups, he explained to Detective Lee, who stood watch by the door. Every camera, every keycard swipe, every computer login, it's all stored for 90 days. They can delete files from the main system, but the backups are harder to find if you don't know where to look. The clock on the wall showed 2:15 a.m. The building was nearly empty, with only a skeleton crew working the night shift. They had maybe an hour before the early morning shift started arriving. Chang's fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through layers of security. "Look at this," he said, pointing to his screen. The security footage they used to arrest Captain Chen. It shows her entering the evidence room at 11:42 p.m. on the night of the Lancaster Street evidence disappearance. But look at the metadata. Lee leaned in closer. At first glance, the video looked perfect. Chen using her keycard, entering the evidence room, leaving 20 minutes later. But Chang highlighted a string of code that made Lee's eyes widen. The file was modified, Chang explained. 2 days before they arrested her, someone spliced together footage from different days, added timestamps to make it look like one continuous video. Good enough to fool most people, but they didn't know about the backup system's file signatures. As they dug deeper, more inconsistencies emerged. The keycard logs showed unusual patterns. "See these access times?" Chan pointed to a spreadsheet. Deputy Commissioner Wright's card was used to enter the evidence room at 3 a.m. multiple times, but look at his phone records from those same nights. The records showed Wright's cell phone pinging towers across town during those same times. Someone else was using his keycard, Lee muttered. Someone who knew they wouldn't be questioned. Chan nodded, opening another file. But here's what really interests me. Every time Wright's card was used after hours, there were specific cameras that stopped recording for exactly 17 minutes. Not broken, stopped and restarted like clockwork. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Late-night evidence room access, conveniently timed camera outages, and modified security footage. But Chang had saved the biggest revelation for last. Remember that corrupted server crash last month? The one that supposedly destroyed months of security logs. Chang pulled up a terminal window. "I keep offline backups. It's standard A practice, but nobody ever asks about them. Those logs weren't destroyed. They were deliberately wiped, but I have copies." The recovered logs painted a damning picture. Officers involved in the corruption ring had been systematically accessing the evidence room during graveyard shifts. Each visit corresponded with missing evidence from major drug busts. The same officers appeared again and again, Lieutenant Patterson, Sergeant Wells, Officer Bryant. But they made one crucial mistake, Chang said, pulling up a video file. The night they framed Captain Chen, they edited the security footage showing her in the evidence room. But they didn't know about the camera in the parking garage. The grainy footage showed two figures entering the building at 11:30 p.m., just minutes before Chen was supposedly there. Lee recognized them immediately, Patterson and Wells, carrying duffel bags. "They walked right past that camera," Chang said. "They were so focused on creating fake evidence room footage, they forgot about the external cameras. And look at the timestamp, the original, unmodified timestamp. The footage was ironclad. While Chen was at home with her family, phone records and home security system would prove it. Corrupt officers were planting evidence to frame her. They'd been clever with the evidence room footage, but careless about covering all their tracks." "There's more," Chang said, his voice dropping even lower. "I found emails. Deleted, but not gone. Communications between Wright and someone in the DA's office. They planned this whole thing, getting Chen arrested before she could expose their operation." Lee's mind raced with the implications. This wasn't just about a few corrupt cops anymore. This was conspiracy at the highest levels of law enforcement. "Can you copy all of this?" Lee asked. "We need multiple backups, somewhere safe." Chang reached into his bag and pulled out 3 external hard drives. "Already done." Everything's encrypted. One copy for you, one for Captain Chen's lawyer, and one in a safety deposit box under my grandmother's name." As they carefully disconnected from the servers, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Both men froze. The footsteps passed by, fading into silence. "We should go," Lee whispered. "Separately. Different exits." Chen nodded, packing up his equipment with practiced efficiency. "Detective," he said, hesitating at the door. "Be careful with this. These people, they'll do anything to keep this quiet." "You too," Lee replied. "Check in every hour. If anyone misses a check-in—" "I know," Chang said grimly. "The files go public automatically. Dead man's switch." As they parted ways in the dark hallway, both men knew they'd crossed a point of no return. The evidence they'd uncovered would shake the department to its foundations. The only question was whether they'd survive to see justice done. The digital trail they'd uncovered was just the beginning. Now they had to get it to the right people before the corrupt officers realized just how much evidence had slipped through their fingers. The FBI field office buzzed with activity at 6 a.m. as Special Agent Morrison reviewed the evidence spread across 3 conference tables. Captain Chen and Detective Lee sat quietly, watching as federal agents pored over documents, hard drives, and photographs. The early morning sun cast long shadows through the blinds, marking the beginning of what would become a historic day for the Denver Police Department. "This is more than we expected," Morrison said, looking up from Chang's hard drives. "Much more. You're not just talking about a few corrupt officers here. This is organized crime operating inside a police department." Chen nodded tiredly. She hadn't slept in 36 hours, running on nothing but coffee and determination. "The question is, can you move fast enough? Once they realize we're here." "They already know," Lee interrupted, holding up his phone. The screen showed a text from Officer Rivera. "Wright just called an emergency meeting. 8 a.m. All senior officers required to attend." Morrison's team sprung into action. Agents grabbed tactical gear and began grouping into teams. "They'll try to destroy evidence," Morrison said. "We need to move now." The next 2 hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. FBI teams, armed with federal warrants, hit multiple locations simultaneously. The evidence room, the commissioner's office, the homes of corrupt officers, the warehouse in the industrial district. Chen and Lee rode with Morrison's team as they approached police headquarters. The morning shift was just arriving, officers walking into the building with their coffee cups, unaware that their world was about to turn upside down. In the commissioner's conference room, Deputy Commissioner Wright stood at the head of the table, addressing his loyal officers. "We have a situation that needs to be handled," he was saying. "Captain Chen has apparently." The doors burst open. FBI agents flooded the room, weapons drawn. "FBI. Everyone stay in your seats. Hands where we can see them." Wright's face drained of color as Morrison walked in, holding up a warrant. "Deputy Commissioner Wright, you're under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy, drug trafficking, and corruption under color of authority." As agents secured the room, Chen stepped in. The corrupt officers' faces showed a mix of shock and fear. They thought they'd silenced her. Instead, she brought down their entire operation. Across the city, similar scenes played out. Lieutenant Patterson was arrested in the evidence room, caught in the act of trying to destroy records. Sergeant Wells was taken into custody at his home, where agents found duffel bags stuffed with cash. Officer Bryant was caught trying to flee the city. The warehouse raid yielded the biggest surprise. Agents found not just drugs, but detailed ledgers dating back 5 years. Every payment, every protection deal, every corrupt officer on the payroll, all meticulously documented. Wright's organization had been efficient, but that same efficiency now provided evidence of their crimes. Back at headquarters, honest officers watched in stunned silence as their corrupt colleagues were led out in handcuffs. The shockwaves were just beginning to spread. Local news crews arrived, capturing footage of high-ranking officers being escorted to FBI vehicles. In the commissioner's office, Morrison's team discovered hidden files revealing the full scope of the corruption. Wright hadn't just been protecting drug dealers, he'd been orchestrating a complex criminal enterprise. Traffic stops were coordinated to eliminate rival dealers. Evidence was stolen and resold. Investigations were derailed to protect their operations. "Look at this," Lee said, holding up a file. Remember the Rodriguez case last year? The one where all the witnesses suddenly changed their stories? Wright had them threatened. We have proof. The evidence room told its own story. Behind a false wall, agents found bags of missing evidence, drugs that had supposedly been destroyed. Each bag corresponded to a case in Wright's ledgers, cases that had been systematically undermined to protect their criminal network. By noon, 27 officers had been arrested. The police department's upper ranks had been gutted. Local news was running constant coverage. Citizens gathered outside the building, watching as more FBI vehicles arrived. In a quiet corner of the chaos, Chen found Officer Rivera and Chang talking quietly. "You two took the biggest risks," she said. "Chang, those backups you kept, they're what broke this case open. And Rivera, your documentation of the patrol patterns? It confirmed everything." Both nodded solemnly. They'd all sacrificed something to reach this point. Careers had been risked. Friendships had been tested. Families had been threatened, but they'd stood their ground. Morrison approached with a grim smile. "Wright's talking," he said, trying to cut a deal. "He's naming names. Judges, prosecutors, city officials. This goes deeper than anyone thought." Chen wasn't surprised. Men like Wright always tried to save themselves when the walls closed in. But his betrayal would help clean up not just the police department, but the entire city's justice system. As the day wore on, more revelations emerged. Files were discovered showing how Wright's organization had manipulated hundreds of cases. Innocent people had been convicted. Guilty ones had walked free. Each discovery added to the weight of evidence against the corrupt officers. In the late afternoon, the FBI brought in extra agents to handle the volume of evidence being discovered. The investigation was expanding beyond Denver, reaching into other jurisdictions where Wright's influence had spread. "It's going to take months to unravel all of this," Morrison said, looking at the mountains of evidence. "Maybe years. But we've got them. They're not walking away from this." Chen stood at her old office window, watching the sun set over Denver. The department she'd devoted her life to would never be the same. But maybe that was a good thing. Sometimes things had to break completely before they could be rebuilt properly. Lee joined her at the window. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now." Chen turned to face the bustling office, where honest officers were already working with FBI agents to restore order. "Now we rebuild, the right way this time." The house of cards had fallen, but from its ruins, something better could rise. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the chance for real change in the Denver Police Department. 6 months after the mass arrests that shook the Denver Police Department, the main courthouse was packed to capacity. The morning sun streamed through tall windows as Captain Chen sat in the witness stand, facing a jury of 12 citizens. Deputy Commissioner Wright and his co-defendants sat at the defense table, their once proud postures now slouched in defeat. "Captain," the prosecutor said, adjusting her glasses, "please tell the court about the events that led to your investigation of the department's evidence handling procedures." Chen's voice remained steady as she recounted her story. The packed courtroom hum on every word. In the gallery, Detective Lee, Officer Rivera, Chang, and others who had helped expose the corruption sat together, a small island of blue uniforms in a sea of civilians. "It started with small inconsistencies," Chen explained. "Missing evidence that had been properly logged. Drug busts where the amounts didn't match the initial reports. Officers accessing the evidence room at unusual hours without proper documentation." As she testified, screens around the courtroom displayed the evidence they'd gathered. Chang's recovered security footage showed corrupt officers tampering with evidence. Financial records revealed unexplained deposits in Wright's offshore accounts. The dealer's ledger provided dates, amounts, and names that couldn't be explained away. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the verdict took only 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Wright and his inner circle faced decades in federal prison. The judge, her voice firm with conviction, spoke directly to the convicted officers during sentencing. "You were trusted to uphold the law," she said, "but instead, you used your badges as shields for criminal enterprise. Your actions have damaged public trust and betrayed every honest officer who serves this city." But the story didn't end with convictions. The real work was just beginning. 1 month later, Chen stood before a different audience, the newest class of police cadets at the academy. The morning light caught her newly pinned deputy commissioner badge as she addressed the fresh faces before her. "Your badges will carry extra weight now," she told them. "This department's reputation was damaged, but that gives us a chance to rebuild it stronger. Every one of you will be held to the highest standard, because that's what this community deserves." The changes were already visible. New oversight procedures had been implemented in the evidence room. Officer Kim, promoted to sergeant, had designed a digital tracking system that made evidence tampering nearly impossible. Every access was logged, photographed, and monitored by multiple officers. Rivera, now a detective herself, led a new internal affairs unit specifically focused on preventing corruption. Her team included officers from different precincts, rotating regularly to prevent any single group from gaining too much control. Chang's expertise had led to a complete overhaul of the department's digital security. New cameras covered previous blind spots. Access logs were encrypted and backed up to secure servers. Even the parking garage had improved surveillance. The warehouse in the industrial district had been converted into a community center, a symbol of transformation that the local residents appreciated. Where drug deals had once been protected by corrupt officers, neighborhood kids now had a safe place to play and learn. Detective Lee, who had risked everything to support Chen, now headed a special task force dedicated to reviewing cases that might have been compromised by rights organization. His team had already identified dozens of wrongful convictions that needed to be overturned. "It's like archaeology," he told Chen during a coffee break. "We're digging through layers of corruption, trying to find the truth buried underneath." The work was challenging but necessary. Each case they reviewed represented someone whose life had been affected by the corruption. Some had been wrongly imprisoned. Others had lost jobs, homes, or families because of tampered evidence or false testimony. One afternoon, Chen received a visitor in her new office, the young dealer whose detailed records had helped break the case. He'd been offered witness protection and a chance to start fresh. "I'm going back to school," he told her, fidgeting with his hat. "Maybe law school eventually. Seeing you all fight for what's right, it made me want to do better." The changes rippled beyond the police department. The city council had created an independent oversight committee, including community members, to review police operations. Regular audits ensured transparency. Body camera footage was properly stored and accessible for review. Other departments around the country began sending officers to Denver to study the new procedures. Chen's team shared everything they'd learned about preventing corruption and rebuilding community trust. 1 year after the arrests, the department held a public ceremony to honor those who had risked everything to expose the truth. Officer Rivera, Chang, Officer Kim, and others received commendations for their courage. The ceremony was attended by community leaders, citizens, and even some of the people whose wrongful convictions had been overturned. "The true measure of justice," Chen said in her speech, "isn't just punishing the guilty. It's creating a system that protects the innocent and serves the community with honor." After the ceremony, Chen found herself back in her old office, now occupied by a promising young captain. The view of Denver's skyline hadn't changed, but everything else had. The department had been rebuilt, stronger and more transparent than before. On her desk sat a framed photo, not of commendations or ceremonies, but of the small group who had stood with her during the darkest days. Lee, Rivera, Chang, Kim, and the others who had chosen truth over comfort, right over easy. The evening sun cast long shadows across the city as Chen prepared to head home. A new batch of case files sat on her desk, not corruption cases this time, but regular police work. Somewhere in the building, honest officers were protecting their community, following procedures, upholding the law. The department wasn't perfect, no human institution ever could be. But it was better, stronger, more worthy of the trust people placed in it. And that, Chen knew, made every sacrifice worthwhile. As she drove home through the city streets, Chen saw officers on patrol, interacting with citizens, doing their jobs with pride and integrity. The shadow of corruption had been lifted, replaced by something brighter, hope for a better future, and the determination to protect it.